Hi, I'm Joel.
Hi, I'm Zoe.
Welcome to another edition of this show that has no name. Glad you're here.
Thanks for
So,
joining.
so last time, Zoe, on the last episode, we talked about you getting started.
Yes.
And this time, I wanted to talk a little bit and ask some questions about some of the struggles that you had along the way just getting started.
Mm-hmm.
So, the first thing I know that you had some struggles with was just the fact that you're a Mac user and we were trying to find you a Windows PC. So, do you
Mm-hmm.
want to talk about that a little bit and just what happened and how we got
Yeah.
around it?
Power BI runs for Windows and I am a Mac user. So we had to kind of find a workaround to where I could access a remote Windows desktop from my Mac computer. And you, in your infinite wisdom, were able to kind of get me access through
Yeah,
Azure. I don't
either
know.
one. It's like GIF and
Mom
GIF.
will, yeah, mom will correct me when she watches. Um, so I had this remote desktop, but then there was settings that neither of us really knew about, and so I would open it and then it would disappear then when I was done working with it. So we had to kind of play around with the settings to figure out that it shouldn't shut down every night
Right.
so that I can use it the next day.
It's a problem like long term
Mhm.
learning right now if you don't have
Yeah,
Windows. And I really hope it's something Microsoft um, fixes. Satya, if you're listening, please fix this
please.
problem.
For all of
Uh,
the nerds out there.
there's a lot of Mac users. And so the second thing that I know you struggled with was just, kind of the scenario that you wanted to report on uh, and getting access to data. So can you talk about that struggle and kind of how you overcame it?
So I couldn't use, due to HIPAA compliance, I could not use data that I was working with at work because it has protected healthcare information. So for this project, I needed to find some kind of data set that I could use, but that was also interesting to me and something that I wanted to know about because I don't want to just pull something random off of Google that I care nothing about
Hmm.
because motivation goes down. So, um, there are some free data sets out there. Since I work in criminal justice, I looked at the Bureau of Justice Institute because they have some reports that they do. And then I know you found some as well. There are some websites that offer free data sets, but then you have to make sure you're saving and downloading the format that can then be uploaded to Power BI, if
Hmm.
that makes sense.
It totally makes sense. Yeah, I mean, earlier this year, I wrote a COVID report, and I think it was very early on. It's probably in April.
Hmm.
I probably looked at, I don't know, 15 different websites just trying to find a free API that I could
Hmm.
consume. And I did finally find one for the
Yeah.
US by state. And, it let me just hook up and refresh automatically to the API. But it's a research project sometimes just
Hmm.
to get data.
Hmm.
What were your takeaways just from going through that? This data thing is an ongoing problem related to BI. So it was
Yeah.
very interesting. Like it was like the first thing you ran into. I found it very interesting because that's
Yeah.
always it's like, hey, let's make all these great reports.
Hmm.
Okay, where's the data? And then
Right.
that's a whole project in and of itself.
I think it's easier if you already come from Excel. So I think it's easier if you have some kind of data set in your possession that's in Excel, because that kind of transfer is more fluid.
Mm,
So, but since I didn't have that, I was thinking, oh my gosh, am I going to have to create an Excel file, dump the data in there? Because I had no idea how this actually worked. I didn't know that you could put a CSV file in there. So I thought I'm going to have to create this data in Excel and then and I was like, oh my gosh, ain't nobody got time for that. So I think you do though have to, like, I didn't know what a CSV file was. So you do have to do some research on even the type of files that are applicable
mm.
for Power BI. I mean, I knew I couldn't put a PDF in there, but I mean, as far as the data format, I
Mhm.
did have to refresh my knowledge on what could be utilized then in the other programs.
That's a great
So,
point. Actually, I
yeah.
ran into the same thing with my COVID report because I ran into a JSON file and I knew what it
Mhm.
was, but I didn't know how to work with it in Power BI. And so then I was like, Google, why does this data set look dumb? This makes no sense.
Fix it.
Yeah. And then,
Yeah.
so what was the scenario that you landed on after your research
So
and the
I ended
format?
up using a CSV file um, that was um, that I think it was the example one that you had used about the facility addresses,
Hmm.
um, and the type of facilities, because I tried 3 different data sets. But the file format I ended up using was a CSV file because I didn't know, I don't know what a CQL is. I don't know what, like, I don't know any other. I knew CSV and Excel. I was like, well, I don't
Hmm.
have Excel, so we're going to go with the other one.
Was there a struggle with, like, you mentioned not knowing about the file types, but actually getting the data into Power BI desktop? Was that, did you feel like that was pretty straightforward?
Um, so there's a screen. So once you select the file that you want, there is another screen that I had no idea what they were talking about.
Hmm.
And it was like separate by decimals or commas. And
Oh,
then
yeah. Okay.
there was like a summarized table by first 200 rows or all, and I was like, I don't know. Load, click. So nothing happened. I mean, it didn't explode, so I assume it was fine. Um, but there was a little like question mark icon. I hovered and it kind of explained what was like, this is just trying to like summarize information of the data set. And I was like, okay, well, sure. So, but it didn't take very long then for the Power BI, I don't know, the processing time for it to then show up in Power BI wasn't very long, which was very nice, even though it was a very large data set. So that was nice. I didn't have to wait very long.
I think you're right that it's a good point for people that if you have an existing Excel data set, it'll make that
Hmm.
step that you're talking about easier and probably more
Hmm.
relevant. How did you feel about pulling the data into the visuals
Hmm.
and just kind of working with the data and the tools? Was that intuitive or was that a challenge?
It was a challenge. Um, when you are just so like it loads all the data and then you just have a blank workspace, and I was like, okay, where'd it go? Where, but then I kind of clicked around and found the I needed to know where it went. So I found there's like the table icon on the left side. So you have the visualization and then you have the data table. And so then I
Hmm.
could see, okay, this is where the columns are, that when I go to create a visualization, this is what it's talking about, because it's not labeled necessarily. It just says column 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And I was like, okay, well, I don't know what that means. So I had to do a little cross-referencing,
Mm,
but um that's part of why I ended up going with the data set that was saved already on that desktop, because when I pulled data, nothing was labeled. And when I pulled the sheets, it wasn't just the data, it also had like extra lines of text. And so if I were to sort by a certain column, it would get all sorts of jumbled. Um, because I pulled a couple of data sets about recidivism rates, and because I find that interesting and it's related to work, but I couldn't get anything to work. So it was I just needed the the numbers and the data sets, but if it's not already set up to work like that, I don't know if what I'm saying is making any sense.
it's
But
making perfect sense. Yes.
if it's not set up to work as a data set, like if you just import a report, let's say, that has like title of the report, what it's for, like there's extra lines of text, then it won't work as a
Okay.
table.
Yeah.
You know what I'm saying? So then when you try and make a visualization of that, it doesn't know exactly what to include or exclude in that data set.
Yeah.
And I don't know
Um,
how to just create it from there.
yeah. Well, honestly, neither do I. I mean, that would take, I think I remember I actually looked, we were kind of looking at the same website and I know which report you're
Mhm.
talking about. And it just
Yeah,
basically the data set wasn't designed for reporting. It was
right,
a report output,
right,
but it wasn't just a raw data set. So you were running into
right,
just shitty data
right.
basically that you were trying to
Hmm.
do something with. But and I think people will run into that in Excel too. Like
Yes.
you need a table of
Hmm.
data to be successful. Now,
Hmm.
there's ways you could create a table out of
Right.
not great data, but that's going to be out of a lot of people's wheelhouse to do
Yeah,
that,
especially in the
right?
beginning.
Yeah, I mean, even a lot of Excel files, you may have blank rows or
Hmm.
summary, you might have
Yep.
subtotal rows or those kind of things in your data set. And then
Hmm.
that's just not going to be as simple.
Yeah. So I think once I switched to using the raw data set that you had suggested, it was a lot simpler. Now, I then had to decide, okay, what am I going to do with a bunch of addresses? Like,
Hmm.
why do I care about how many facilities are in Texas? So, what I did realize though is that there were different types. So I created a visualization of how many overall, like I did a stacked graph of how many facilities were in each state, just like plain facility. And Texas had the most. And then I did how many of each type of facility, because there's state facilities, but then there's also work release or community corrections, which are more run by local administration and are kind of, they're not diversion programs, but they're ways that inmates can serve their sentence while also being in the community. So it's like instead of jail time, you're doing what is that called? Community service hours. It's kind of like
Hmm.
that. So I was curious how many of those programs were in each state. And so I kind of did a representation of that. If you have like a reason for doing it, or some kind of application for the data set or goal, I guess, it might make it a little more smooth. But since I was just playing around with it, I was like, well, what do I want to know? And so, but
Mhm.
then I really liked how you could just drag and drop like the title of what I wanted. So if I wanted type, I dragged it into the access or the value option, and then it would just populate in the graph. So that was really nice that I didn't have to manually input anything.
You needed a little help along the way just on some of the fundamentals of getting started. Um,
Mm-hmm.
you know, once you got past sort of the data hurdles,
Mm-hmm.
then it seems like you were just able to do more stuff. And so um, maybe that's something to think about as somebody is
Mm-hmm.
starting,
Mm-hmm.
can you get past the data hurdles, in an
Right.
easy way? Like you said, Excel's probably the easiest data hurdle
Mm-hmm.
as long as it's in a table.
I think once you're able to kind of get over the data hurdle, it becomes a little more easier to manage. I will say in the visualizations part of it, you need to have some kind of basic stats knowledge to know the graphs or like the visualizations that are going to be the visualizations that are going to be generated, because not everybody's going to know what a stacked bar graph with a line graph is going to represent, or how that would be applicable to the data. And
Mhm.
I mean, you could hover over each icon and it would tell you what it was, but I only knew a handful of what those were. If you didn't have some of that knowledge, it would probably take a little additional research to make yourself more familiar with all the different reports that are available to you.
Mhm.
So,
One of the things that's interesting from a data perspective, when you actually deploy Power BI to a company, there's
mm-hmm,
basically a way that you can give new users a data set in Power BI desktop.
mm-hmm,
They don't have to do like everything from that perspective is just pre-done by somebody else who knows
mm-hmm,
Power BI, and you're
mm-hmm,
just being presented sort of the visualization step. And since that's
right,
kind of the easiest step and you can start exploring it at that point, you've skipped a few hurdles along the way,
right,
and then people can sort of work their way backwards into
right.
the data aspect.
See it?
Yep.
Okay. Here you go.
Cool.
um, so basically, this top one, I'm not sure what this is saying. what I this so this one down here is it's not by state, but it's by type. So how
Mhm.
many of each facility there are throughout the US. This is by state, um, how many there are in general. Because what I wanted to know is by state, how many of each type of facility there is.
Mhm.
So I still haven't gotten there yet, but this is kind of in the midst of playing around with it. Um, because what I would do is just, so over here is all the different columns of data that there are. And so I've just been kind of picking one of these and then dragging some of these into these and seeing what happened. What I found helpful was over here, because this makes sense to me. I am comfortable working with this. And so when I originally looked at this, I was like, okay, well, why do I care about the addresses? But then I found that there were all sorts of different facilities here. So that's what kind of populated this idea of finding out the different types that there were for each.
One of the things I wanted to find out through this process of talking to you is like, what do you run across? What's your intuition taking you to when
Hmm.
you get in here? And where is it like sort of hidden the stuff you need to learn?
Yeah.
Um, and that's an interesting part of the process because
Hmm.
that's different than, if you're just training somebody new and they're not just investigating it on their own,
Hmm.
you might suggest things, but yeah, like I said, I'm always curious to know what's intuitive. And if you've been in the software, then you forget what's intuitive. You just know
Sure.
the stuff that you know.
Right. I mean, I think to start off, the the get data, that's a really intuitive. Sure. Yep. I know that. I can do that. um, but to what I was talking about, these visualizations over here, uh, some of these I know.
We were talking, I was kind of thinking about the next steps. And I think it would be interesting if I gave you a few pointers along the way for the next report and kind of go to what does it look like? What does my hello world report look like? And then what does my
Yes.
little bit of help report look like? And then we can kind of keep track of the pointers and
Hmm.
talk about those in the next episode and see how it helped.
Yeah, I wrote, Joel, need more guidance. So,
Yeah, like I said, I think I knew you would, but I
yeah.
was curious to see because I think as a viewer, when I wanted some expectation setting about like what is it like to just download it
Mhm.
and get into it, and what is that going to be like
Mhm.
before we got into the help that you need.
Yeah, and I think too it was good for me for practice because if I had gone in and you had already given me pointers on or suggestions as to what I would look for, then there wouldn't be a contrast between the beginning download and our end result, or there wouldn't be as much of a contrast.
Yeah. Well, cool. I think it's cool that you were able to get through it and even get past the hurdles and
Yeah.
get your Hello World. Do you know what I'm talking about with Hello World? It's a programming
No,
nerd
but it
joke.
sounds good.
No. Yeah. Okay. So it's a joke when you're learning programming that your first program is always just printing Hello World to the screen.
Oh,
Like the first thing you always do just to like learn the basics of how do I
got
print
it.
something to the screen in program. So it's like my first world. So episode
Got
title.
it. Love it.
All right, great. Well, thank you for all your hard work. And
Yeah.
until next time, keep reporting.
Doing doing what you're doing.